Today we are working on a 2006 Nissan Maxima. The project for today is replacing the valve cover, gasket, and the air filter. So the first step is you want to take whatever cover that's on the motor. So we have the engine cover that's held by 4 bolts. Loosen that up and just raise it up and take it away. Next, you want to take this air vent and remove it. Usually it's held in by 3 or 4 clips, but this vehicle has no clips on it. Next, disconnect all battery terminals, negative and positive. The negative is held by 10 millimeter and the positive is held by 12 millimeter. The reason for this battery disconnect is there will be a lot of clips, connections, throttle bodies that we're going to be disconnecting. Ignition coils, any wiring that will be in the way to get to the valve cover. Unplug 3 plugs connection that's connected to the ignition coils, and there will be a few that is connected to the O2 sensors, and there will be some wires running down that we will need to disconnect that runs down to the compressor and the alternator. There will be some clips that will need to use a pry tool to pry those clips out to disconnect. You will need pliers to unclip the hose. Next, you will use a 10 millimeter to break loose the bolts that's holding the ignition coils down and follow it with a power tool to release them quicker. After that, mark your coils to make sure they go to the return to the correct location. In this job, we will also be replacing the spark plugs since we're in that location. Now you will be breaking loose the 10mm bolts that's surrounding the and holding down the valve cover, and there should be a total of between 10 to 12 bolts that's holding each valve cover down. Once you break that loose, you can follow it with the power tool to release them quicker. Key, always have a magnetic tray or bow so you can hold all these bolts and nuts. I'm going around with a magnet stick and just pulling each bolt out and dropping it in the magnet tray. After that, make sure everything's clear and pull the valve cover off. Sometimes you might have to tap it with a rubber mallet just to break it loose because it gets stuck. And there's your old valve cover gasket. The reason for us replacing the valve cover gasket is because customer complaint there was an oil leak, and most often leaks come from the top of the engine where the valve cover, and when the valve cover wears out and dries out and cracks, the uh, the oil will find its way through the cracks and leak down the engine. So we have the front easy valve cover off. Now we need to get to the back one. Because this is a V6 six-cylinder, there will be 3 in back, 3 in front. So to get to the valve cover in the back, we would have to take the intake manifold off because it's right below it. So there you saw me take the air duct off that's connected to the throttle body, and it's connected by 2 clips that you need an 8mm to release it. From here, what we're going to do is unbolt any brackets, connection, bolts, nuts that's connected to the intake manifold. There will be a few, 2 or 3, about 4 hoses on the back end of the intake manifold that you will need to release. Um, and there will be some clips as well. Right now I am disconnecting stuff from the throttle body. Right now, I'm trying to figure out if I should disconnect the throttle body from the intake manifold. But I think later through this video, I decide that I'm just gonna leave it on there and work my way around it. There is a copper line or metal line that actually runs right into the intake manifold, and that's what I'm releasing right now. Um, that line is actually, you might have some difficulty with that when you try to remove the intake manifold, because it's a metal line that doesn't flex. So, you know, it's kind of difficult to pull something out when it doesn't flex out of your way. And it's held on by two 12 millimeter nut. And as you see, I'm trying to pull on it to check if it will flex, and it doesn't. So now I'm going to disconnect everything that's connecting on the top of the intake manifold. You got a few lines here, some small lines. Make sure you make note of which line goes to what. If anything, keep a diagram or specs or information on what goes where. If you do not have that, just make note of everything that when you disconnect. What I like to do is when there's like 2 or 3 lines going to a location, one top, one bottom, or whatnot, I always like to have me a marker, a permanent marker, or some kind of marking so I can mark them to make sure what goes where. Right now I'm breaking loose the 12 millimeter bolts and nuts that is holding down the intake manifold. There will be 3 bolts and 2 nuts. The nuts will be on both sides of the intake manifold, and the 3 bolts will be towards the center. And here I am pulling them out. There will be a bracket on the back end of the intake manifold that's held by 1 or 2 12 millimeter nut or bolt. So you would have to reach back there and loosen that up. Any intake manifold that's designed this way will have a bracket that's holding it from the back end. And it will be a tight spot to get back there and loosen it up. And there is a couple of hoses back there that you will have to use some needle nose pliers or extended pliers to reach back there and unclamp that. And there you have that bolt that I was talking about from the back that I just showed y'all. It's just one. And I'm clamping the hose that's held on to the back of the intake manifold. It makes job harder when your arms are pretty thick where you can't get into tight spots. This is where I was talking about that one metal line on the other side of me that's holding the intake manifold down. So it's kind of you really got to use some force and kind of just pry that away. Um, at the same time, you got to be careful. You don't want to mess up anything, any lines, or mess up the throttle body or the intake manifold, because the intake manifold, of course, is made out of aluminum, and airflow is going through there. And if you crack it, bend it, or whatever, you know, you're gonna have air leaks. So, gotta use force, but at the same time, be careful. There's that second line that's back there that I'm gonna release. Everything's loose. It's just trying to be careful of what we're doing here. Checking and making sure nothing's in the way that I might ruin, that will give me a headache later. So I finally broke it loose. Like I said, you gotta use force. What I did was I got a little pry bar on that hose and kind of just pulled it back and pulled the intake manifold up, but it's loose. So what I'm gonna do is pull the intake manifold up and just put it to the side. Something's caught on to the back. Again, I'm trying to figure out where I don't want to ruin any lines or any holes or any connection. So trying to be careful. when doing this job, you just got to be patient and just be really careful. There was still a line that was connected that I didn't disconnect. I thought I did. So that's what I'm prying it out. When a hose is connected to something for a very long time, it's kind of hard and difficult to, you know, remove it. So sometimes you gotta pry it out, whatever. But at the same time, you don't want to damage it or crack it because you gotta reuse that hose. Also, back here on the intake manifold, there's some harnesses that are connected to a few things back there, and those harnesses are there's a bracket on the back side of this intake manifold. Those harness clip onto, so you got to release those harness from those bracket so you can move the intake manifold, and that's what I was doing, was releasing those clips. And there you have it. It's finally released, so I'm going to move the intake manifold to the side. And if you could see back there, there's that green harness. Yeah, those green harness back there are the one that's connected to the clips, and I'm pointing at those brackets, and those harness are what was holding on to those. And then if you can see, there's two valves where the hoses connect to the back, but I think what was really keeping it from coming out was those bracket that the lines connection hold on to. Now I'm disconnecting the plugs to the ignition coils to the back. And of course, there's three because it's a V6, three in front and three in back. Once you disconnect those, unplug those coils, and some of them will be kind of tricky, so you're gonna have to use something to unclip them and break them loose, but do not break them. So I was just checking around to make sure to see what I need to do. Um, Now what I'm doing is breaking loose the bolts around the valve cover. And again, it could be from 10 to 12 bolts all the way around the valve cover. The back the back end is always the most difficult because it's just harder to get to. So I was wiping the ignition coils so I can mark them. That way I can put all the ignition coils back to where they belong. There's one ignition coil. That's two ignition coil. And here's the third one. Alright. Well, it looks like that coil had a little oil on it. So because of the valve cover gasket uh, wearing out and stuff, oil will go down into your spark plug from the top. So that also indicates that it's not now time to change out the valve cover. So I'm breaking loose the rest of the valve cover bolts. The farther and the lower things get, the more difficult it is to get to them. So it's always good to bring out the power tools because you don't want to be sitting there just ratcheting away. That will take minutes for one bolt when it can take seconds for a power tool. And again, you want to break it loose first before you use your power tool. There's a lot of cables in that corner that's in the way, and that's why it's tricky. But once you get in there, you're able to get it out. But at the same time, you don't want to strip the nut or bolt or and lose the bolt and nut. So you just got to be really careful. Finally broke it loose. Now it's time to bring in the power tool and loosen everything out. You know, if you were to look through a manual on removing or installing a valve cover or anything, and there's multiple bolts or nut, usually they have a sequence, like where to start loosening up or tightening. To me, when you're loosening it up, as long as you evenly break them loose and then go back and really remove them all with a power tool or whatnot, I think it's fine. Now, sequence two, installing. To me, I feel like it depends on if you if you need to torque it a lot, like the head to the block, then yeah, I would understand you would need to do the sequence or the um, anything that's you know important, pistons, whatever, intake manifold. Yeah, there would be a sequence, but with valve covers, little things like that, you know, I don't think you need a sequence. Yeah, you should kind of separate them, like do each corner and then the center, and then go back and repeat it. That way, everything lines up and tightens down evenly. I guess that's why they would have sequence to it. But removing it, I wouldn't worry about it. So I'm at that corner again, trying to get that bolt out. If y'all are working on this job and you find a better way of getting that bolt out without any of those wires interrupting you, then leave a comment at the bottom or whatever, and let me know. That way, when I do a job like this again, I can get around it. So all the bolts are out. Just make sure if there's missing any bolts, making sure if all the cables are away from it and not in the way. Make sure I don't bump into anything that may crack or damage anything because it is a tight area. So I'm checking how tight this is because the front end, as you can tell, when I unbolted it, it just kind of came out loose. But this one it feels pretty tight on there. So like I mentioned at the front, sometimes you have to either pry it a little bit or tap it with the hammer. So there I am prying it just a tad bit, not too hardcore or anything, but I broke it loose and now I'm gonna remove it. And then you saw all that. This one is pretty bad looking. The gasket is just ruined. It's actually still stuck to the motor. So pull that out.